The Professors is brought to you by Blackborder.com, an MTG site that delves heavily into every format of Magic, drafting with the pros, constructed testing, and deck design with the high-level mages, some of the best stories of the game, as well as Rise of the Eldrazi boxes, cases, intro packs, and more. So support the show and go check out Blackborder.com today.
What am I supposed to do when the best part of me was always you? And what am I supposed to say when I'm all choked up that you're okay? I'm falling to pieces, yeah.
Hello everybody, welcome to yet another episode of The Professors. This week we'll take a look at the top sealed submission from last week's sealed pool. We'll also talk about the new tech, so let's draw.
I'm still alive but I'm barely breathing.
Last week I challenged you guys to rebuild a sealed deck from my sealed pool which I received at the pre-release. As usual, we had over 100 submissions, but unlike usual, the majority of submissions, note there was a majority archetype, were not what I expected. While I built a red-white deck at the pre-release, believing my removal was the best and that my defensive strategy with walls that dealt you damage was good, you guys not only disagreed but showed me how to really play the Leveler Gambit. While 23 of the 106 decks submitted were red, white, and blue, nearly all 57 blue-white decks submitted played up the Leveler concept. At least 18 lands, Venerated Teacher, Champion's Drake, and Time of Heroes made for, when I did some test runs, decks with enough of a sub-theme and in a format slow enough that levelers could push through. Aside, though, white had the most apparent removal in this pool. Smite, Puncturing Light, and Oust are 3 of the best 5 pieces of removal in the set. Also, while you only have 13 of the 22 spells in the deck as creatures to hold up the field, the lower amount of removal in the set, especially in red, when everything is slower but has a higher power to toughness to converted mana cost ratio, mean that the ones you throw onto the battlefield are more likely to live. So playing 1 equipment and 1 totem armor were basically the minimum with this pool, and rightfully so. Let's take a look at Marvin Chiong's finished build.
They say bad things happen for a reason, but no wild words gon' stop the bleeding. Cause she's moved on while I'm still grieving, and when a heart breaks, no, it don't break even. Oh, and what am I gonna do when the best part of me was
I
always
supported playing the Super Friends or Super Pals or Super Walkers deck because of its diversity. Jund is a deck still being hated against and obviously expected. However, Super Pals had a price tag of over $700 and its matchups, at least I found, were shaky anyway. So I needed to design a deck with just the cards I have, which is to say 2 boxes or less from each set in Type 2, and had the Conley Woods Rogue deck design style. However, it would also need a good matchup versus specifically the Planeswalker deck, Jund, and Blue-White Control. Then a fellow Magic videocaster reminded me of something. Evan Irwin stated that Spreading Seas is the best blue card in Standard, and while I don't agree and think Jace 2.0 ranks above the enchantment for the number of options it offers, Evan also pointed something else out. He observed the fact that Convincing Mirage and Contaminated Grounds weren't played because they didn't allow you to draw a card. But then I got to thinking, why aren't they being played? Black and blue are the least and second least played colors in the format respectively, so Spreading Seas shutting your opponent out of colors plus drawing you a card, and Contaminated Ground shutting your opponent out of colors plus dealing them damage is not only powerful, but when teamed with a few other shutdown cards, it's just unfair. Realizing that the deck would need some more damage and removal, as well as a way to turn off their remaining lands and shut them out completely, adding red became necessary. With red, Goblin Runeblaster, Terminate, and Lavaclaw Reaches became apparent add-ins. However, while this land removal suite was nice, the deck was still missing a high-curved land destruction spell. Originally, I did some testing with Demolish. At first, it seems absolutely terrible, right? Like, totally overcosted compared to Reign of Tears. It's like comparing Counterspell in one format to Cancel in another. Clearly, Demolish for its converted mana cost of 4 is worse than Reign of Tears with a converted mana cost of 3. However, Reign of Tears was playable in the LD decks back in the day, so Demolish might be too. After some testing, Demolish appeared pretty good. However, I then found out that the deck couldn't deal enough damage to the other side while simultaneously locking down their board. Turns out this was pretty easy to fix though. I cut the 4 Demolish for roiling terrain to deal 2 to 3 additional points of damage per game. I also found that Lightning Bolt, which had previously made it into the deck, though, was not performing as well as I'd expect. The card was very rarely used to deal your opponent damage, and ended up being pretty bad card advantage versus Cascade. So I cut the bolts and replaced them with Vampire Nighthawks, and, well, I couldn't ask for a better card. Its removal, it races for up to 4 and it flies, so my sideboarded Earthquakes wouldn't deal it damage. Finally, I was ready to test the finished list. But how does it perform? Well, I literally can't double guess my record, being that it's 8-0 online versus Jund, Blue-White Control, Super Pals, Mono Red, Eldrazi Green, and even Vampires. Let's take a look.
What am I gonna do when the best part of me was always you? And what am I supposed to say when I'm all choked up that you're okay?
Technically speaking, the only bad matchup I can think of for this deck are Vampires and the Mirror match. I'd expect my monocolor matchup to be horrible, but it turns out that Eldrazi Green having no removal lets me hold up the board with flyers and removal until the lockdown of all their forests is complete pre-sideboard, and add that strategy to a massive Earthquake post-sideboard. Against Vampires, even though the deck itself is mono-black, they usually run 25 lands and have no additional mana sources, so screwing up their lands early on and making them discard the remaining cards is the lethal strategy I'm going off. I firmly believe that black is underplayed in this format, and this deck hasn't been found because people don't understand the power of simply destroying their opponent's plan while dealing them damage, instead of just building up your own plans for the battlefield. Really cool Planeswalkers and Baneslayer Angels are powerful in a vacuum, but what about when they get discarded, terminated, or you just can't play them in the first place? Well, turns out, they're not so good. And the chances of one of those three happening is, funnily enough, not all that unlikely. In current, in real-life testing experience, the deck takes forever for its strategy to roll out, and going to time is not unlikely. In fact, I've gone to time in 5 of my 7 matches. However, due to Grixis Good Stuff's ability to surprising degenerative ability, being that it's already a rogue deck in terms of colors, but also in terms of strategy, I've won all 5 of the game 1s in these matches. Even when 3 were against the same deck and 4 of these opponents knew the contents of the deck ahead of time. Compared to any other deck with 2 or more colors, the what I'm calling unfixing destroys them not only in the early game for anything above a 2-drop, but is plentiful and fruitful enough to let you screw them over later on, say on turns 4 through 8. Spreading Seas always gets you a card and will probably shut them out of a color or shut down a manland. Contaminated Ground shuts them out of a color and or gets rid of a non-basic land while forcing them to pay 2 life if they even want to use it, and Convincing Mirage allows for plain old color screw. But how exactly do you hold up the fort against the early creatures when your early game goes alright, but your late game plans for color screw don't work out right? The answer is a little help from Discard and Vampire Nighthawk. It races, it kills stuff, it made me a pizza once. And while it does seem like a deviation from the rest of the strategy, it's just that good of a card that no one's playing. In fact, I'll say it, far better than Lightning Bolt. For a sideboard plan, if you plan to pick up this deck, I'd suggest boarding out the 4 Terminates for your double negatives against the current version of Jund. Against Super Pals, I suggest boarding out the Terminates for counter Squalls. Against any sort of Eldrazi Green, White Weenie, Mythic, or Mythic Conscription decks, I'd suggest taking out the 4 Terminates and Goblin Rune Blaster for 2 Deathmarks and 3 Earthquakes. Against Bant Polymorph, I suggest boarding out 3 Goblin Rune Blaster for 3 counter Squall. And against Blue Eye Control, I suggest boarding out 2 Terminates for 2 Deathmarks. So, as you can see, the sideboard isn't transformational and doesn't have any super tech, but it fixes your problematic matchups against pretty much everything. But honestly, I'm running out of ways to say how good this deck is. You'll just have to test it for yourself. But it is really, really good. Good luck with the standard PTQ season, and until next week when I talk about my newest concoctions results at the New Jersey National Qualifier and have an extra episode about the soon-to-arrive Deck Builder's Toolkit, this is Anthony Palmario, on behalf of the Professors. We're tapped out for now, but we'll on tap soon.
She's like